Welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center that has been established 57 years ago. Books in the World has been continuously broadcasting for over 41 years, and we strive to interview published authors to better understand their impact on the world at large and their writing techniques. Now, in addition to Books in the World, the Cape Cod Writers Center also hosts an annual conference every year, and what we're going to be doing for this year is between August 4th and 6th, we're going to be hosting a fabulous get-together. So we highly encourage you to come out and join us. If you want more information, please go to capecodwriterscenter.com. My name is Jonathan Ryder, and I'm interviewing Juliet Grams, and we're going to be talking about her wonderful novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. Now, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, no, I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. The story essentially follows the fascinating family saga of the Fortuna family, specifically Stella Fortuna. Now, it begins in Italy, specifically Calabria, where it eventually moves to Connecticut, where the family immigrate to build their future together. Now, there's many interesting and harrowing things that occur in that time, but the story tends to focus around family traditions, sometimes breaking them and sometimes breaking them down, and also the pull of personal identity and what that means to each individual member of the family. Now, Juliet has actually worked with the Soho Press since 2010, and that editing style and detail definitely goes a long way to see how much is done in the book itself. Now, the level of research that went into this book is very obvious from the get-go. You can see it without a doubt. And I'm just wondering, for a story this involved, what led to the creation? What was that spark that came from this?
Well, Jonathan, we've only just started our conversation, so you haven't seen me use my hand gestures yet, but the truth is I'm actually Italian. I'm very, very Italian, and I grew up in this very encompassing Italian-American family in Hartford, Connecticut. And I loved the traditions and the culture and food, songs, stories, everything that surrounded me because of my immigrant grandparents and what they taught me, the love that they gave me for the culture that they'd come from. And I think my whole life I was fascinated by that. And as I got older and I tried to read more novels or nonfiction that really captured their specific immigrant story and their specific experience, I found I wasn't satisfied by anything I was seeing, and it became one of those classic scenarios where I had to write the book I wanted to read. So my family, like many, perhaps the majority of Italian-American families, emigrated from the south of Italy. And it's a part of Italy that is not written much about. You know, it's a place we don't go on vacation. We might go to Rome or Venice or Florence, but the fact is the Italian south is really rich, and so I think especially fulfilling for an Italian-American to read about, to connect with, because there's so much there that will resonate, will explain why our ancestors were driven to leave this place that they loved so much, and to inform a lot of the shape, the dynamics that we've adopted here in the United States as Italian-Americans. But, you know, I think more specifically, there was one triggering episode that happened when I was 5 years old that made me committed to telling this story in some form. And that was my immigrant grandmother, who had come to this country in 1939. She and her beloved sister had raised me, took care of me while my parents were working. I mean, I spent a lot of time in this family, but she had a cerebral trauma, and she ended up having a lobotomy to save her life, an experimental procedure. She was in her upper 60s. This was in the 1980s. So the thought was that she probably wouldn't survive. It was extremely risky. And if she did survive, she would end up being a vegetable. You know, she wouldn't be able to walk or talk or feed herself or anything for the rest of her life. But we went through, I say we, it was my mom and her generation, her brothers. They went through with the procedure. They would do anything to save their mother's life. And it was a miracle. It was a phenomenal success. She recovered almost completely. We have a photo of her actually attending a party 6 weeks after the lobotomy, and you can tell her head is still shaved, and she's wearing lipstick and a party dress. It's great, but she had been lobotomized, so her personality was drastically changed. And what happened was, when she woke up from her coma, she was no longer willing to speak to her sister, who had been her best friend her entire life. The two of them had raised all of my grandmother's children together. I mean, they were like this their whole lives. And then for the last 30 years of their lives, they never could be in the same room together again. It was something my lobotomized grandmother, was never able to explain very clearly what had turned her against her sister, what thing in her medically altered mind had she been reminded of, or had resurfaced, or had she invented, that made her sister into her worst enemy. And it was heartbreaking for the whole family. And when I was 5, it affected me very deeply, I think, because I loved both of these women so much, and to watch them not be able to get along anymore. It was like my 2 grandmas, they couldn't be together. I started toying with ways of talking about their story specifically, but more generally, this class of immigrant women who came over in the 20s and the 30s. These immigrants from all cultures, I think the bravery of coming to a new place like the United States, where you will not be in the majority, where your language may not be spoken, and that longing of the homeland you're leaving behind. I wanted to try to capture all of that in an homage to that generation of immigrant women.
Oh, that's absolutely beautiful. And I feel you very much did a very good credit of that, because throughout the entire story, there's so many harrowing things that occur, but then there's also the extremely sweet and extremely endearing side of the family that is constantly trying to push on, strive to live, and enjoy each other's company. And that bond of sisterhood was established so early on in the story that when it did get to the point where there was that break, it was very heartbreaking. And I think there's definitely many points in the story where people will definitely have to take a moment, because it definitely almost becomes overwhelming with how much is established, because there's such a playful, such a endearing quality to both of the sisters in their own ways. Because I found Stella at times was completely narcissistic, but she was also extremely charismatic, and it was hard not to like her. So on that note, actually, with the concept of family sagas, because it definitely is without a doubt a very nicely depicted family sagas. Are there any other family sagas that inspired kind of you when you were creating this, or?
Family sagas are just one of my favorite genres of literature in general. I love them. I eat them like candy. But I think one that I specifically took a lot of comfort from the fact it existed was Jeffrey Eugenides' Middlesex, which, it's a story about a contemporary American person who is understanding themselves through the framework of their grandparents and their grandparents' immigration saga and the secrets that were kept in order to become American. And that's a really beautiful book. And another one, I don't only mean to be naming Pulitzer Prize winners now, I apologize. I have a whole list of these, but I absolutely love Carol Shields' The Stone Diaries, which is perhaps not as widely read, but it's a beautiful novel about a Canadian woman. It's a faux biography. It's fiction. It's a novel, but the author has gone as far as to include photographs to bridge that gap of realism and fiction. And that was something I really wanted to do here. I wanted this family to feel like a real family and to come to life in a way, playing with that difference between fiction and nonfiction. Those are just 2, but I could go on.
Understandable. I mean, there are so many amazing family sagas that do strike such a strong chord with people, and I think you very much did depict a very strong concept of a real family. In fact, actually, halfway through, I was like, wait, this is fiction? Like, you kept throwing me a lot, especially with like the meticulous details you did. I think in Narcosa, there's a festival that you describe, which I found just absolutely fascinating. I've had the good benefit to actually be part of some of the festivals in Italy, and they are extremely unique. One thing I was wondering is what kind of research did you do to figure out what it was like back during Stella's time growing up for the festivals?
So the book spans about a century. You see, really, the earliest scenes are set around the time of World War I, and it goes up to about, now. And I wrote with great confidence about the scenes set in the United States and the modern history, like the 50s, the 60s, books, I could read books I could interview living people to try to construct those pieces. The section set in Italy from the teens through when the family immigrates in the 30s were really hard, because you cannot, in the same way, rely on. I'm such an old-fashioned, American college-educated nerd. You think that information comes from books. It does, but not when an entire group of people have never had books written about them, when literacy was not very common in this very underdeveloped, really neglected region of Italy until the 30s and 40s. People didn't have the opportunity to write their own stories. So what we have to do, in fact, is privilege other very important kinds of sources that I think academics often will neglect because they're not as academic. But things like folk songs and stories, and especially recipes. I was looking at I'm telling women's stories, which are even less documented than the male counterparts in this era. And so to tell the women's stories, one of the most surefire ways of preserving what your mom or grandmother or aunt did is looking at what she cooked. And it's not only that it's the tradition, it's not only that you see what she ate or fed her family, it's not only that you see how she celebrated a holiday, you also see from this recipe what she was harvesting at that time of year, how she was preserving it, and then suddenly the hours of her day start to fill in because you know how she's spending her time. You can imagine some of the other details, like how is she taking care of her children? Her husband is not there, of course, because he's emigrated to the United States, where he's trying to send money home. I mean, all of these pieces start to come together when you're looking at just one recipe. And the other thing that recipes are really cool for. As I was interviewing, I conducted more than 100 interviews, both here in the United States and also in Italy. People, either immigrants or remembering their experience, or people remembering their mothers or grandmothers or grandfathers' experiences. Also, I got really lucky in some of these mountain villages where I went to do research. There were centenarians who actually remembered the period I was writing about. And for some of these older interviewees who can be very humble and not think that they have anything interesting or worth telling you about, sitting down with a tape recorder and being like, tell me about your life. They'll be like, oh, there's nothing to say. They'll be very modest. And the way to draw a woman out is to put her in her kitchen and have her show you one of her signature recipes, if she's willing to share. She may find that proprietorial, but she may be willing to cook for you. And so really a recipe becomes a form of conversation, a way of giving her the higher ground, a position of confidence to be able to realize how much she has to tell you. And you can start to draw out the stories from there.
Definitely. Yeah, I find that recipes in general have such an amazing anthropological kind of element to them. I mean, my family was from Portugal, and a lot of their recipes and so forth, like my great-grandmother has recipes that she's written down that's been passed down generation to generation, and even in there you see like little notes that talk about her life in general, so you can find some interesting elements. And on the note of recipes, actually, so when I started reading the book initially, I didn't know that there was a little hidden gem connected with it. Would you like to talk a little bit about the companion recipe book?
Oh, sure. So I brought a copy here. This is available on my website. Anyone can download it. I made it for book clubs, and my publisher, Echo, thought it was a great idea, and they were very supportive and helped me. They designed this beautiful. So it's called the 7 or 8 recipes of Stella Fortuna to tie in with the book, but you'll see there's a little bit of narrative in each. They tie into the storytelling, and I hope it's just a fun piece for readers, especially if you're looking for snacks for your book club.
Of course.
But the recipes are drawn from these interviews I did. They're all taken wholesale from some woman who shared her story with me.
Oh,
and
that's
in
terrific.
one case, a man. I don't mean to sound like I interviewed many men as well. And this happens to be a book that it really revolves around a sisterhood and around their relationship with their mother. That's the core tenet here. But the stories of immigrant men, equally fascinating. And I had so many that was forced to leave off the page that they're going to make up a whole next book.
Understandable. Yeah, I mean, definitely the concept of sisterhood and matriarch kind of pretty much family is very much in the forefront. And unfortunately, the male characters tend to be more the villains and the adversaries at times, but a lot of times I found it interesting in the book where the narrator comes through and gives a little bit of enlightenment in the fact of like, you know what, they weren't that bad, but in Stella's story, they were the villain.
Yeah.
And I found that kind of very strong gray area very appealing. And on the note of the narrator, actually, I found the narrator very interesting in the omnipotent element in which you were able to kind of make things very ominous because the narrator already knows everything that's going to happen. So they kind of slowly give a drip of truth to the reader as things are going. And it made it very visceral, I found, for myself. I actually was reminded a lot of times of The Book Thief, actually. I had a very kind of similar kind of feel that I found that had. Now, when you began the story, were you did you come from that narrator perspective, or did it develop as you were writing it?
I knew I was going to write. The main character of the book is really Stella. Most of it is from her kind of third-person perspective. I tried writing the book in different voices. I tried writing it from Stella's perspective, and that seemed like what it should have been at first, and I kept hitting walls. And part of it was because I found there are issues that thread through Stella's story, which you've already touched upon. My main issue here is the patriarchy. It's just so the problem with a hereditary patriarchy in a marginalized society like the one that Stella comes from is that women are, already, you're not allowed to own land. You're not allowed to control money. You literally don't own your children. Your husband owns you and the children. The women are so disempowered in this system. And looking at it, we find that the system is rife with violence and other kinds of problems that in our more gentle world, we have tried our best to heal ourselves of these ills. And I really wanted to write the truth about that, because the fact is, almost all of us are the product of immigrants. Many of us are descendants of refugees who came here from equally brutal, life was brutal a few generations ago. And if we don't acknowledge the trauma that our ancestors endured and perhaps enacted upon one another, we don't understand ourselves. This isn't just about epigenetics or about the trauma that we may have inherited from our parents who inherited from their parents. It's actually genetic. They've proven that trauma enters our genes and is passed down to the next generation. So I think that talking about our grandmother's stories, our grandfather's stories, our progenitors' stories, and making sure that we find a way through this cognitive dissonance, that we can revere and love the people who gave us life and who sacrificed everything to get us everything that we have today, but to still acknowledge that they may have hurt one another, that they may have caused one another harm. This is a key to understanding ourselves. I really wanted to write about that hardship. Mm-hmm. That was another one of the things I didn't see in the books, talking about this immigrant experience. I find that our Italian-American narratives, Italian Americans for so long felt that they were a marginalized community in the United States. There was, at the beginning of our time here, we did experience prejudice and brutality and sometimes violence. But what we've done is at all costs now, we've tried to protect the image of our community. And it means that we've never written about or looked at, really analyzed some of that, the cost to our foremothers in this patriarchy. I really, really wanted to write about that.
Definitely, and I think you did a phenomenal job on that respect, because something that I find a lot of historical fiction does is it shies away from the darker side of things, mm-hmm. like the things that are traumatic, the things that make you almost cringe and make you almost like put the book down, which I noticed throughout the book. No matter what was happening, you were telling the story as true as you possibly could. The narrator was always giving every single very nitty-gritty detail that was sometimes difficult to read. Mm-hmm. And I found that very much a very real feel. Like I said before, it felt a lot of times that I wasn't reading a work of fiction. I was reading something that was almost a memoir.
Thank you.
And it was beautifully done.
That's actually, you've touched upon the reason why I did feel I needed to use a modern narrator. To bring it back to your original question, I wanted to say those things. I wanted to depict those details. And the fact is that Stella herself wouldn't have had my perspective, and she wouldn't have necessarily agreed with my social mores. She may not have realized some of the things happening around her and to her were as wrong as I think they are. And so, I cheated, and I put that modern narrator in so I could make some of that commentary and not undermine or introduce anachronism to her voice. But another thing about Stella and her time and how hard life may have been for so many of our forebears, I think that it's critical to point out they did survive and they thrived, and part of that I think was their sense of humor and their chutzpah and their all of these more endearing and playful qualities that did carry them through that darkness, and that was also really important to me. I didn't want this to be, I wanted to talk about these harrowing topics, but I didn't want the book to be just a pile of vegetables. I wanted to show that they had fun in their lives. They got through because they had a sense of humor.
Definitely, and I found that that undying sense of fortitude was something that every single character pretty much showed quite substantially. Even the ones that weren't necessarily the most likable, they still had that fortitude to keep going on, to keep pressing on, and keep trying to help their family the best they could in their limited ways sometimes. Now, one thing, actually, on the note of trauma, the 7 or 8 deaths of Stella. So that was a fascinating thing because honestly, when I saw that name, I was like, that is an interesting book. That's a book I want to read. So did you start with that when you were writing it? Did you base it around the deaths of her, or did it come up from different ways?
So I've told you a lot that this is a novel, and it's fiction. It is fiction. But my grandmother gave me this nonfiction gift with her insane life story. My actual grandmother she actually had 9 near-death experiences, but it got to the point that I was like, I can't fit anymore. And the thing was, as I considered her life, which I was using as one of the first templates for this immigrant story I wanted to tell, as I was starting to bring in other women's stories, I looked at, each of these near-death experiences is a piece of an allegory about what's dangerous about being a woman in the 20th century. I mean, it's dangerous, the cognitive development portion of like learning what fire is in the world. Education is dangerous for a woman. Immigration is, of course, dangerous. Oh my gosh, courtship, so dangerous. All of these ways that my grandmother's bizarre freak accident near-death experiences, they seem larger than life. They're all just true. I didn't even fictionalize them. I just used them.
That's good to know. Yeah, I was wondering about that because they were very visceral, at every point. I specifically remember the one which was about the pigs, actually. And that whole element where she felt like some supernatural force was holding her hand closed. So that was completely true?
Well, no, I had to make up the perspective details or how things came about. But it was funny that episode that happened to my grandmother happened in 1926. And it was actually when I went to Yevoli, her village. I did a long stay there. I took a leave of absence from work to just go live there over the winter of 2015 and interview people. But I met several centenarians who remembered the incident, and they had slightly different perspectives of what had happened, but the corroboration of the key facts was fun. I hadn't really believed it could have happened the way she described it, but it turns out it did.
Understandable. Now, as we've mentioned before, there's so many secrets wrapped up in this book. So many people that are avoiding it, whereas the narrator is trying to do everything that they can to explore it. And I think there's kind of a quote in there that is essentially that was the reason why the narrator wanted to write this story. So on that note, was that definitely another one of the core focuses you wanted through the story as well?
The idea of exposing secrets, that's really tricky. And it's one where I think families often bend over backward to protect their secrets for really good reason, especially if your family is vulnerable, is on the margin of whatever community they feel like. This is true especially of immigrant communities where you're trying so hard to be accepted by the mainstream, but it applies to many people. And telling secrets is always a fraud endeavor because you may be finding justice for one party or you may be victimizing another party. I as I was writing, one of the reasons it was so important for this book to be fiction was because I definitely didn't want anyone thinking I was telling anyone's secrets. And it's another reason it was so important to me that so many different women's stories came to make, Stella's and her sisterhood. They're made up of the information volunteered to me by many, many interview subjects. I wanted to create more of a feel for that generation and the things that might have been endured. As for whether we should be telling secrets or not, it's fascinating. I have to think about that more.
It's an interesting gray area, that's for sure, because you're not sure if the secret is favoring one side or the other, or if it's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say how that can develop. So it definitely is very fascinating. Now, on that note, though, did your own family, was there any fallout that they thought, hey, that character's like me? Why are you writing about me?
Oh my gosh. I was really worried that they were going to react, especially, we all loved and revered my grandmother. She never could tell her own story. And they all knew for years that I was working on this book. They all helped me with it. They introduced me to further interview subjects. They let me interview them. I was more worried they were going to read it and be like, this isn't grandma. This is like, this didn't happen, but because I did, invent it. But they haven't been like that at all. They've been so supportive.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. One of my uncles, I think, has to date purchased something like 27 copies. I'm like, please don't buy any more copies.
Well, speaking of copies, I've heard that you have a second novel coming out here soon, The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
job.
Hey,
Yeah.
I got a little bit of Italian I've picked up from time to time. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah. I mentioned that I had so many interesting men's immigrant stories that were left on the table by this book is already fairly long. I couldn't pack more in there. I really wanted to write a story celebrating immigrant men from Italy, from the Italian South, and the hardships they went through, and some of the fascinating stories I got there. But also my day job, which you also mentioned, I'm a crime fiction editor. I've been editing mystery novels now for these many years, and I thought to myself, could I write a mystery novel? Am I ready to try that challenge? So The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia is a mystery set in 1960 in Calabria in a very remote mountain village. It's so remote that they actually still speak a form of classical Greek called Greconicus. This is a real thing. And the main character is a 27-year-old American idealist who is there working for a charity organization. And she thinks she's going to fix the world, or maybe she's going to get embroiled in a murder investigation and doesn't know where not to stick her nose in when it's not her business.
Oh, excellent. Well, unfortunately, we're pretty much about run out of time now. I'm sure we could be talking for hours on end about this. This is a phenomenal book. I highly recommend anyone can pick this up. Any of your local bookstores, online, or if you want to go straight to the source at www.juliegrams.com. And then you might even be able to pick up that cookbook as well. So thank you again so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure, and it was an absolute pleasure reading that book. So in the meantime, though, we thank you so much for joining us for Books in the World. Please go to our website at capecodwritercenter.org. And then also, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until then, we look forward to seeing you next time.